genetically enhanced super warriors. What could possibly go wrong? Guys, it's Paul, and today we are checking out the Thunder Warriors lore by Baldemort. You channel members voted for this. Let's get into it. Baldemort introduces. Baldemort's flair for the dramatic is just unmatched. Just want to point out, the servitors are the weirdest, darkest, or the, I guess skull assistants is one of the weirder, darker things in the Imperium. Imagine dying and then a little part of your brain has to stick around just to like hold a scroll and write with a quill. Honestly, he even has an inkwell. Like, what sort of miserable future is this that you can't afford to manufacture a real pen?
A long, long time ago. For Sergeant Fortuno, the last 10 minutes had been a blur, a terrible blur. He had been ordered to go into the old quarter to track down one man. His eyes widened to almost bursting when he was instructed to take his own and 2 more units with him to be sure. 30 Astartes, 3 full squads, just to take down one man. What was he, a Primarch? In the next half day he learnt the hard way. They had been tracking him in the streets, closing the net, when matters suddenly turned on them as they strung themselves out to make sure he could not escape. The net was wide. Tiberius' squad was strung out thus when it came. One after another of them in quick succession was ended, the life signs going flat in mere instances.
Yeah, these sort of the trope of being hunted by one incredibly lethal, dangerous, and unseen enemy is mostly fictional. There's a handful of cases where this sort of thing has truly occurred. Usually, the best example being like Simo Haya, the famous legendary Finnish sniper. There's some like kind of quasi-apocryphal stories about recon snipers and scout snipers in Vietnam being able to do similar feats to outmatched opponents, though tracking someone through the woods is hard, like really hard, and it is an arduous process. So being able to track someone in something like, say, a city, which is much more navigable, is even harder still.
Fortuna ordered the men to close ranks and almost bunker. What in the name of the Emperor and all his sons could do this to Astartes? Gracchus' squad was there 1 minute, gone the next. He heard them shouting as something large had just appeared amongst them and was killing fast. The one sentence he made out was confusing. "It's in power armor." Finally, it came to their turn. But it did not speak or pounce on them. It just walked towards them, as bold as brass, as clear as day. A massive man, but definitely a human, but too big to be even an Astartes. It was wearing an archaic set of power armor, the likes he had never seen before, but for all its simplicity, it protected the monster within as he charged at them. It took many shots, but few penetrated its armor. When he hit the squad, he went through them like a hot knife through butter. It crushed them and killed them, all until it got to him. Armor damaged in places, blood soaked. It was slower now. As it reached toward the sergeant, his power sword leapt up and cut off both the extended hands. The Astartes then, without a nanosecond of hesitation, stepped in and impaled the huge being with his power sword.
I appreciate the fact that the meta, right? I know the meta scenarios that Baldemort plays a sort of Imperium historian, and you notice he refers to the Thunder Warrior, despite identifying him as human, as an it. It did this, it did that, it charged. And this is interesting, and I think an accurate reflection of kind of the xenophobic imperial culture, where being human is not defined as DNA or as, you know, looking a certain way. It's your worship of the emperor and you're standing with the Imperium. By definition, you fight with the Imperium, therefore you are human, because the Imperium equates itself with humanity. So to oppose the Imperium is to not be human, right? And this is something that I think is a really important lens for analyzing any sort of history going back more than, more than 100 years, is that we conceive of the in-group, right? The defining thing that defines humanity or that defines a person is different in different generations, right? Almost every single original, like indigenous or native language that you can find anywhere in the world, anything pre-modern, the word for human is also the word for that people group. Now, does that mean that they never saw another person? No, of course not. But it means that they othered all other people groups other than themselves, right? So if you spoke the language, you were a full human. And if you didn't, it was a reflection of the fact that you weren't fully human, despite having 2 arms, 2 legs, and 2 eyes. So I think it's really important when we look through history that we consider what was the thing that these people of that historic generation were told or were raised to believe was the thing that defined their humanity. Was it standing with a certain government, speaking a certain language? Was it following a certain religion? And if you have that mandate, then you see that, like the Imperium, the people who exist outside of that mandate don't really get to be counted as people.
It plunged dead center between where an Astartes' 2 hearts are, but most definitely it severed its spinal cord. A stroke that would kill a Marine instantly. Yet still this being lived. As it slowly toppled backwards against the wall, it slid down, leaving a large red patch across the wall. The sun lit its face in a golden halo as he closed his eyes, basking for a moment. He was dying. His eyes opened. A trickle of blood came out of his mouth before he started.
Spoke too soon. Now he's a he. Maybe he just said it because they didn't identify what it was they were hunting.
To quietly speak. How could he? We marched for him. We fought for him. We bled for him. We died for him. Everything he has today, everything he has achieved, everything he owns was bought with our toil, our suffering. He was our leader, our general, our king. We trusted him. We would have worshipped him if he would have allowed it. Nothing he asked was too much. Never anything we gave enough. He was our lord, and we would have followed him into hell if he had but asked. But he betrayed us. How could he? The last battle of the war. The last outpost of resistance on a conquered world. We wondered why he did not just loose nuclear weapons at it and flatten it.
Yeah, we've talked about this in other videos. This is a really common thing among any sort of authoritarian leader who has a subgroup, and it's often their military because, of course, authoritarians rely on force as their primary vehicle of power, is that when they have a military commander or a military branch that is consolidating a little too much power, a little too much loyalty, and they start to suspect this person may have designs on usurping their authority, or maybe just could one day have designs on usurping their authority, a really common move is to send that branch or that general or that unit on a no-win mission. And it enables a couple of things, right? Either they win at a cost so tremendous that their base of power is diminished. If it's, say, the Air Force, they don't have enough planes to oppose you, or they fail, in which case they can be justifiably fired, ostracized, or even charged with treason and eliminated. Or of course, they can succeed, but in doing so, they spend a considerable amount of time far, far away from you, your inner palace, your most influential people, and you are able to build a power base outside of their influence. This is super common in Rome. You often saw generals who were troublesome being assigned to the provinces to deal with, rebellious tribes there as a way of preventing them, or at least stalling them out before they would march to the capital itself and try to seize power. Obviously, backfired after a while. Once Caesar does it once, everyone else wants to copy the playbook.
Mount Ararat, where the very last separatists on Terra huddled awaiting the end of all things. One last obstacle to the beginning of a bright new era. The Emperor's rule, a unified Terra, a unified home for humanity. We did not fight for this, it is true. We fought because we loved it. We fought because we were raised on conflict and slaughter. We fought because he made us anew, made us unstoppable, unbeatable. But most of all, we fought for him. For the Emperor. It was to be the last object lesson, you see. We were not distributed much ammunition. We were told we would not need it. The entirety of the remaining Thunder Warriors would scale the mountain and plant the flag of the Emperor upon its summit and usher in the new Golden Age. It was going to be a bloody assault, but the result was foregone. They would not stand a chance against us, his Thunder Warriors. And so,
man, this guy has a long speech for someone whose diaphragm is impaled. Yep, worth noting that you have to, if you stab someone where their heart would be, well, one, let's say we can hand wave away the fact that the heart doesn't work. But what you need is a diaphragm, because the diaphragm is the muscle right underneath your lungs that expands and contracts and creates the vacuum that draws air into your lungs. It's the thing that allows you to breathe. And if you puncture it so that there is no vacuum, then you have this sort of collapsed lung situation where you can't actually draw air into your lungs. And in addition to suffocating you, you can't talk because you have to breathe in and push the air out and your vocal cords vibrate, and that's what gives you the ability to use language. So if you are stabbed not in the heart, but it pierces the diaphragm at all, your ability to talk will be pretty limited.
it was.
You certainly won't be pontificating like this dude is.
It was easy. Bloody.
I know. He's the Thunder Warrior. He has 50 different redundant organs.
Easy. Proudly we stood arrayed for a parade on the Mount of Ararat, waiting our reward, waiting our acclaim. The war was over. The deed was done.
See an orc? The war was over. You get...
When the custodians, the Emperor's personal guard, arrived and took up positions at the edge of the plateau, we assumed it was to add to the event, the pomp. After all, it was a day of circumstance. Then the nightmare began. The custodians levelled their weapons and walked towards us, opening up. Their fire seared into our ranks and cut us down in our droves. In confusion and pain, we ran one way or another, trying to escape, but there was none. I even thought I saw him there. I will never be certain, but I think I saw Thunder Warriors fly into the air so high that only he could have been doing it. A few of us broke the spell of confusion and our instincts kicked in. We charged the lines of custodies, and with great losses we broke through. Pitifully few of us, but I was one.
Yeah, these sort of routes, obviously this is an ambush and you think it's a friendly force and it's not, but these sort of routes often have tragic outcomes. And I want to make a distinction here between a rout and a retreat. A retreat is where military order is maintained. This is usually characterized by one element moving backwards as another element fights a delaying action against the enemy. Once the other element is set in battle positions, then the the element that was fighting the delaying action then retreats, right? These are sort of systematic bounding retreats, moving back through fighting positions and fighting locations, right? Military order is maintained. A rout is when the chain of command breaks down and soldiers begin to pursue exclusively self-interest. They no longer fight or maneuver as units. Instead, they are panicked individuals trying to just survive. In World War I, or early in the fight, you saw some Russian forces have this happen due to mostly their poor command and control. And these forces would scatter throughout a battlefield, running mostly back the way they had came. Often, it precludes a hard push by the attacking force, who often, because they have military discipline to rely on, can use motorized or better modes of transportation and will advance much faster than the panicked soldiers fleeing. So that is a rout. And when you have these sort of routes, they tend to go, well, extremely badly. In the Russian example I talked about, the Russian commanding general was actually killed in a swamp, if I remember correctly, as him and a personal guard attempted to retreat back to some sort of friendly Russian lines. But another example is in the Spanish Civil War, of course, as the Republicans were defeated and the nationalists seized Madrid. Often the Republican army had to fight it was not a rout, it was a fighting retreat, but a fighting retreat to France. And tragically, sort of like the Thunder Warriors, the Republican army was held in basically camps in France, awaiting, sort of in limbo, until France was taken over, of course, by Germany, who was much more loyal to Spain than to the Republic of France. And so generally they ended up either being returned to Spain, where they were faced trial and usually execution, or forced to work in labor brigades.
We ran and ran, and I've never stopped running. Unlike most of my brothers, I am more stable. I've lasted by hook or by crook, a gene splice here, a concoction there. But each day has been a battle. It became a battle I no longer wished to win. So I let them find me. I let you find me. One last battle, one last day of fire and swords and skill and honor. I have bested over a score of the things created to replace me. I can die at peace with honor. I'm going. You think you love him, would do anything for him, for duty. You think he loves you, that he honors his warriors. He does not.
Yeah, guys, this is this is true in the modern world as well, right? It is extremely common to be grateful that you have a warrior class or a group of soldiers who defend your country and do the bidding of your politicians. But it's really important to note, very, very, very few politicians' children spend any time in the military. They avoid it like the plague. And that is ultimately a reflection of how these things are viewed. The military is a complex animal, but it's the judicious use of soldiers' lives is not a foregone conclusion. You can see the sort of waste of time that Vietnam or Korea or Iraq and Afghanistan were. No national interest was at stake. It was mostly done as a lark, but thousands of soldiers were killed in the process. So mostly, you can be sure that, like the old emperor, a lot of the talk about duty and honor and gratitude is mostly just empty talk.
You are as I was, just his latest tool. He will discard you when your usefulness has elapsed. He will kill you all, like he killed us. His honored, his loyal, Thunder Warriors. How could he?
As the Emperor, as we've discussed, you spend enough time not being a human being, and you just almost have no choice but to look at human lives as being nothing, as being just statistics. And, you know, this is actually not too uncommon among, again, generals that occupy very high office, among CEOs of corporations. Eventually people, the mass of people, stop seeming like people. And some of this is a natural function. Again, you cannot know the name or the faces of 10,000 people. So you have to just look at them in the aggregate. You cannot have 10,000 people, but you can look at what is their average age, what is their net average salary, what sort of jobs are they trained to do, what can they do for me, what is their readiness. You have to aggregate people into non-human categories. This is just how society works. This is how even the earliest empire, right? You look at like Assyria, you would find the earliest cuneiform records have to talk about people like this, right? You can't fully humanize even 1,000 people is almost impossible. So you have to like check yourself against this, but good leaders do their absolute best to never forget or to remind themselves that these statistics are human lives and they're human beings. But it's a pull that's easy to succumb to, right? And it's sort of the better you are at managing large groups of people, the less you humanize them, the more successful you are. The more successful you are as a CEO or as a manager or as a general. And your problem that you run into, of course, is that when you select for that a couple of different promotional ladders, you end up with people who are sort of like sociopaths, right? So you can imagine that if you're the emperor of mankind, you are the highest of all hierarchies, and you have been for basically tens of thousands of years. You could see he will view all human beings as little more than tools. The difference between a Thunder Warrior being killed in the womb and being killed after 200 years of service and life is nothing to him. It's a rounding error because that's just how he has reduced human beings. That's what would probably happen if any of us could be in charge of huge groups of people for thousands of years.
With that, the huge man's eyes glazed for the last time, a single tear drawing a pitiful trail down his already greying cheek. Welcome, gentle listener. I am Baldemort, your faithful servant, and I wish to introduce you to the forces, factions, and history of the Warhammer 40k universe. Today, we shall take a necessary step backward in time, to the era before the Great Crusade, over 10,000 years before the present timeline of the setting. Today, we discuss, in brief only, the Thunder Warriors.
I mean, I feel like we pretty much covered the bulk of it already.
Not only are they a fundamental part of the history of the Imperium, and show the development of the Space Marines, but their tragic tale also shines a light into one of the murkier edges of the character or purpose of the Master of Mankind, the Emperor. An important step to take for an entry I am working on. For there are so many ways to view the Emperor, but in Arthur or Solomon he is certainly not. He is as complicated as any character you will find in this grim and dark universe. To a certain extent, it could be argued that he is its most important character.
I mean, one of the things that whenever I hear about the Emperor, right, and his own sort of self-aggrandizement, it just always strikes me that I'm always reminded of a quote from Dr. Manhattan, right, from the end of Watchmen. I think it appears in both the comic and the movie, in which she goes, "The world's smartest person poses no greater threat to me than the world's smartest ant." And I think it's one of the things that, to me, defines my understanding of the Emperor. And that's this idea that fundamentally the Emperor is a warp-connected and immortal human being, but just a human being, right? He has never shown any evidence that he isn't subject to vanity, greed, lust for power, probably just regular lust, right? He has every single aspect of humanity. Blindness, I mean, not literally eye blindness, but the inability to perceive something in front of you, like intellectually. And so I think that's a really important thing to remember, is that this dude, the Emperor, is a person, because obviously he fucks up, right? If he was a god, he would just look forward in time, see how an Astartes was made, and then make the Astartes and not a Thunder Warrior, right? There wouldn't have to be an iterative process, because a god would be able to iterate the process themselves, right? If you're a god, you can just, and you're not subject to the laws of time or space. You could literally make the Thunder Warriors as a thought experiment and understand exactly how they would play out, and know in your mind, walk it back and be like, no, we're going to make them Astartes. So to me, this is the fact that he obviously makes mistakes is one of the number one traits that defines him as a human and not a god. Also, the fact that he said he's a human, not a god. But the idea that he can attempt to rally humanity against actual divine forces, and believed insanely that he could actually cut a deal with divine forces, is like comical to me, and a reflection of the fact that he just had a level of hubris that you cannot hold a candle to, right? The idea that a human being, no matter how big or smart or long living, could ever pull a fast one on a divine being, something not even subject to the laws of time or space, is ridiculous, right?
But let the digression end. For today we talk of the Thunder Warriors. What were they? When did they fight? For whom and why? Well, I hope my introductory story has shed a little light at least, but let us get into it. In the times before the Emperor arose, the human race had gone from titans bestriding the galaxy to being on the verge of annihilation. Human technological marvels knew few limits, but this enlightened age of prosperity and peace was not to last. A myriad of woes occurred in short order, and the previously beneficial government fell, as planets were cut off from each other and pandemonium and horror ensued. What then came were millennia of suffering and regression. On Holy Terra, the birthplace of humanity.
Yeah, this is, again, I've talked about this in other videos. It's at least in human history, you don't usually see regression, right? This idea that societies or that humanity in the broad sense regresses collectively, I don't think is actually true. The classic example is like the fall of Rome, right? Where you could tell the Warhammer 40k universe draws a lot from Roman and medieval mythos. But the fall of Rome, people say, oh, there used to be a really big government. Now there were much smaller governance structures. And that is not really an accurate way of looking at things. One, they say, oh, there were still peasants in Rome. The vast majority of Romans toiled in immense poverty. In fact, in some ways, they had an almost quasi-slavery relationship with, at least in the late empire, with their landholders, right? They would be forbidden, for example, from ever leaving their land. It would just not be something they could do. They were beholden to the land, beholden to work it, and they were not required to receive wages from their landholder. So, and when you look at the architecture, right, the stuff that remains, yes, Rome had a really distinctive style of architecture. But to say that other great works of architecture were not built is incorrect. They often appeared, in Turkey, in the Hagia Sophia, or modern Turkey, then Constantinople, right? You also see in the Middle Ages that cathedrals, a combination of stone and glass, using architectural techniques that were far more complex than anything the Roman Empire used. And that's all really important to me, because it shows that while we believe this sort of Victorian notion that Rome was glorious and the Middle Ages was trash, it's just sort of that's just sort of a fashion sense, right? That's like saying the fashion in the 80s or music in the 80s was great and in the 90s it was trash. It's not true. They're different, and they certainly evolved over time, right? The music in the 80s used techniques and processes and technology that wasn't available in the 70s, but it's unfair to characterize one as being a golden age and another as being a dark age. Humanity just doesn't have those sort of strong regressions. Now, that doesn't mean it can't happen in isolation. You can have pockets, obviously. If you ask me, do I want to live in Syria in 2002 or 2013? The answer is pretty clear, right? But it's important to note that this whole, because there's a lot of people, a lot of conspiracy theorists, a lot of tinfoil hat folks who believe the sky is literally falling and we're just days away from, humanity falling away to Mad Max sort of levels of development. And that is pretty unlikely. And maybe it could happen if something like 99% of the population was to vanish. But here's what I remind you. Think about your own job. Think about the 100 people you work around. If your workload was reduced by 99%, could you single-handedly do the job of the 100 people like up and down your chain? Maybe. Maybe you could, right? So, and maybe not. Maybe you do an essential job and there is like zero backup. There are some jobs like that, as we've seen here in the 2021 labor shortage, where a lot of important jobs aren't getting filled, and a lot of second and third order effects are really hitting the country pretty hard, namely things like inflation, the inability to get goods delivered, et cetera, et cetera.
Previously called Earth, it was probably one of the worst of all. The technology of destruction was still available on Earth, though all progress had stopped. But still, weapons of war and despicable practices in gene manipulation were rife and unrestrained. So tyrants and despots arose, one after another, again and again. They were soon dubbed Techno-barbarian kings, as they had all of the technology one could ask, but not one scrap of civility in them. The wars were horrific, and nuclear exchanges smashed and irradiated huge swathes of the globe. Added to this were entire nations controlled by xenos, aliens, or by psychers and warp entities, demons. It was unfettered war on every conceivable level, and fought with a barbarity and brutality that is beyond conception in gentler times.
Yeah, this is a completely realistic scenario. Again, we see it. Syria is a great example. Just there's a race to the bottom that happens when you have these groups infighting. A power vacuum is what it's usually called. And you also see it in places that are dominated by cartels, drug trafficking organizations. And because what will happen is you'll have a single cartel, usually, that can charismatically unify sort of all the parts of the process. And everyone in the process is getting paid, right? The person at the top is receiving obviously the most money, has the most control, but everyone is getting paid, and the risk to the cartel members is low comparatively, right? And obviously you're doing something illegal, but what happens is oftentimes governments will come in and they will attempt to shear off top layers of these organizations, believing that the person at the top of the hierarchy is the biggest criminal, right? And so what happens is when you shear off that top part of the hierarchy, you end up with a number of individuals who suddenly want to fill that power vacuum. Someone has to be in charge. But when you've sheared off 2 or 3 layers, you're talking about 25, 10 to 20 different people who all believe they need to be the ones to unify and become the dominant person. Or they decide that they think they can earn more money by not having to sort of kiss the ring and pay up the hierarchy. The result is, of course, a huge spike in violence as they try to fill that power vacuum. So this is a completely normal scenario to have the first couple layers of an organization or a hierarchy chopped off, and in the power vacuum, everyone else either tries to become the dominant faction or feels that they will get a better deal by going independent. Of course, like always, the losers are always the ones at the bottom. Just like, the cartel violence is always perpetrated by low-level foot soldiers against each other. And just like here, these techno-barbarians are not nuking each other personally. They are nuking people who are unfortunate enough to be born in their territory.
This backdrop, the Emperor arose. But before he revealed himself, he had already labored for centuries on the creation of an army. His genetic mastery was more than many of his competitors, and he forged many a strain of genetically augmented super soldiers. His most potent, bar the Primarchs, were ever his custodian guards. Despite their potence, the time and resources it took to create one were preclusive of massed formations. So there were many stages, but one of the most important and widespread were the Thunder Warriors. Soldiers made from a different clay to fight a different war. For the thing that the Emperor required to do was to gain dominance of Terra. From there, he could harness its resources and then build and unleash his planned crusade across the stars. But perhaps the hardest war the Emperor ever fought, bar possibly the Horus Heresy, must have been the Wars of Unification. So many enemies, so various strengths, so terrible in their aspect and their power, they deployed their own forms of enhanced warriors, either robotically or genetically or even warp-twisted. The wars were to be fought with a level of ferocity that few can grasp, so weapons of unquenchable anger and destructive ability would be required. So did the Emperor recruit from the...
It just always bothers me that in a world with nuclear weapons, right, and total war, it seems difficult for me to conceive that individual infantry formations would be decisive, right? Infantry formations are useful for capturing things that you don't want to destroy with a nuclear weapon. And maybe that's the situation we are talking about here, but with an era of advanced robotics, advanced genetics, even things as he discussed, the warp, why he would choose to just have human beings in armor with essentially pea shooters to fight a wholesale force-on-force war seems a little bananas to me, given that he would have access as the Emperor to many, at least the knowledge of the existence of other technologies.
Most vicious tribes and material, and then enhance them to a degree only slightly below that of a custodian, in strength and resilience, power and speed. The Thunder Warriors were much stronger than a Space Marine. Much. But corners were either cut by design or out of pragmatism. For the Thunder Warriors were always unstable. Often it would be a mental instability that would make them burst into unpredictable hyper-rage that could lead to a rampage. But it was more often physical instability, the heart exploding under the pressure, their minds collapsing. Some accounts could be hyperbolic, but it was recounted that some would simply twist inside their own skin or become geysers of blood at any time. Many will say that the Emperor cut costs and time required to perfect the process in his desire to unify Terra. Many will say that the Emperor was learning as he went and perfected the process in the Astartes, trading some raw power for longevity and stability. Many will say that the Emperor knew that they were a blunt instrument and that he required to bring the horrors on Terra to an end, and that he knew they would outlive their usefulness.
Yeah, this is one of the, as we talked about, when you command a large enough force, you just have to view your problems through a different lens. If you say that, hey, every year, 2%, 1 in 50 of my Thunder Warriors are going to have some sort of fatal event, but you know that you need them to fight for, let's say, 100 years, and that you can make them at a rate that scales up such that 2% is negligible, is a negligible risk for you to take. It's just like It's just like there's certain businesses, right? If you have, say, a business that relies on memberships, you can know, well, you don't know how long an individual member will stay. Some might be a member of your business for decades. Some might be a member of your business for a year. But if you look at the mathematical average, you can be reasonably sure that a person will have a defined length of stay, right? So you'll say, okay, if you're a member, the average member is 18 months. Well, if you know that, right, again, like we talked about, you have to just look at people as numbers a little bit. You say, okay, we've got 18 months. You expect some drop off, just like the emperor probably looked and said, listen, there's going to be some drop off. And again, they're human beings, their lives. I mean, it's fiction, I know, but they're human beings and they have lives. But you just have to accept that you got good enough and that additional time isn't going to help you.
So, like many thousands of Roy Batties, they were not built to last. These will also state that the ticking time bomb within all Thunder Warriors meant they would never be an issue for long if they did rebel. For in a short time, they would simply burn out. The light that burns, as they say. The Thunder Warriors were the bulk of the Emperor's primary forces all throughout the Unification Wars. They fought all of the horrors of that age and were perfectly designed for it. Their power meant few could stand against them in the field. Their enhanced resistance to psychers and the warp even outshone those of the later Astartes, so they were equipped to strike down most enemies. They died in their thousands as the Emperor continued his genetic works and formulated the Primarchs and later the Astartes, the Space Marines, from their templates. As the war progressed, the Emperor's gene labs stopped producing Thunder Warriors and exclusively made the new format of gene soldiers, the Astartes, the Space Marines. Whatever one might think of the Emperor's modus operandi, his next actions were very direct.
No, that's a nice way to put it.
The last nations fell before his grinding advance. Only one place remained, a small rebel enclave on Mount Ararat. The Emperor amassed all the Thunder Warriors that remained, and in one hammer blow he sent them all in to wipe out the last separatists. What is told to the Imperium, even to this very day, is that the very last Thunder Warrior placed the flag of the Emperor into the carcass of the very last separatist that he had slain. Then that proud Thunder Warrior, the last of his kind, died of his wounds. Poetic, tragic, a fine example of patriotic zeal and self-sacrifice. A shining beacon.
Yeah, I mean, always funny to hear the hero myth. And one of the things I think is so interesting is that if you ask the separatists, right, the last ones, again, they're fictional, what percentage would say, I don't want to live under a dictatorship of the emperor? What percentage would say the emperor is going to appoint himself a god? What percentage would say he wants to create a theocracy in which human beings will be slaves, right? What percentage of people were right and just chose to fight against it even if it meant losing? You know, this is sort of the changing moral compass over time, right? The emperor appeared like a source of light, you know, a source of goodness, but with a long enough view, many of the criticisms of these sort of things that were sure are moral goods in today's world, will be proven to be flawed deeply and sort of birth the problems of the future world. This is, of course, an iterative process, right? This is how all moralities sort of operate.
Generations to come. Alas, it is a lie. None can really know why it happened, not now. Some will say the Emperor identified a coup. These warriors, having no enemy to fight, must have planned their own future for when the war was over. Some will say the Emperor could not permit them to be at large in his newly civilized world. Some will say the Emperor saw them as a tool, that it simply outlived its usefulness. For whatever reason, the Custodian Guard were ordered to surround Mount Ararat, and then to slaughter every last surviving Thunder Warrior. Some tales hint that the Emperor may have even taken a hand in it personally, but most details state it may have just been his guard. But they wiped them out. The warriors that had given the Emperor victory had given him the jewel in the crown, terror, the cradle of humanity. These warriors he slew without pity or mercy. It is a secret he has kept from his Astartes, his Primaris, and his population for the long, long life of the Imperium.
Yep, the propaganda myth, man. I mean, like I said, it's a good reminder to every soldier is that as a soldier, and I say this as one soldier myself, you are always a tool. You are a tool built for a purpose. And the day your purpose is no longer needed, the government will let you know. It always does. Always, 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 always does.
None know of this secret. So, if this is the Emperor's pathway, his character, an indication of his morality, his will as a human, powerful and immortal human, but a human, just imagine what
just like we talked about
to do if or when he has all of the power of a god.
Yep, pretty spooky there. All right, guys, thanks so much for joining me on this. We are 45 minutes in. This was an awesome look at an awesome part of lore. Thanks so much for voting for it. If you want to vote for my next video, be sure to become a channel member. And until next time, I'll see you guys later.